Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we embark on a journey through some of the most terrifying haunted house stories ever told. These are not just tales to pass the time, they are experiences that have left indelible marks on those who lived them. The stories we share tonight are not for the faint of heart. They explore the dark corners of the human experience, where the unknown and the unexplained lurk, waiting for their moment to emerge. If you are someone who finds excitement in fear, then stay with us as we delve into the mysterious and the horrifying. Our first story takes us to a small, unassuming town on the Kansas-Missouri border, where an abandoned house has stood untouched for over 2 decades. This house, with its faded pink exterior and decaying structure, has a history that has kept the townsfolk at a distance. No one dares to go near it, and for good reason. The house has a dark past, a past filled with tragedy and death that continues to haunt it to this day. I grew up in this town, and as a child, I was always warned to stay away from the old pink house next to my father's property. My father would tell me that the house was cursed, that it had been the site of a terrible event that left it tainted forever. The story goes that a mother, driven to madness, hung her child out of the window of the top floor before taking her own life with a gunshot to the head. Since that day, the house has remained vacant, caught in the limbo of probate, with no one willing to claim it. It was as if the house itself had absorbed the horror of that day and now held it within its walls, waiting for someone to release it. As I grew older, my curiosity about the house grew stronger. Despite my father's warnings, I couldn't help but wonder what was inside. What could be so terrible that it kept everyone away? When I was about 14, I decided that I had to find out for myself. With a group of friends, I made my way to the house one afternoon, determined to explore its dark secrets. The house was just as eerie as I had imagined. The front door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, and the air inside was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture was all but destroyed by time and neglect. At first, our exploration was uneventful. We wandered through the rooms on the first floor, finding nothing but old, broken furniture and debris. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the windows were so dirty that they barely let in any light. But there was something about the house that felt off, something we couldn't quite put our fingers on. The silence was oppressive, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Despite our initial fear, we were determined to see everything the house had to offer. We made our way to the staircase that led to the second floor, the place where the tragedy had occurred. The stairs creaked under our weight, and with every step, it felt as though the house was protesting our presence. When we reached the top, we were greeted by a long, narrow hallway lined with closed doors. It was darker up here, the air colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. We started opening the doors one by one, finding nothing but more empty, decaying rooms. But as we approached the end of the hallway, we noticed something strange. There was a pile of old letters scattered on the floor, leading to a small, dark closet at the very end of the hall. The letters were yellowed with age, some of them dating back to the 1980s. We had no idea who they belonged to or why they had been left here, but they seemed to form a path, leading us to the closet. The closet door was slightly ajar, and as we stood in front of it, we all felt a sense of unease. None of us wanted to open it. It was as if the closet was a portal to something we were not meant to see. But despite our fear, we knew we had to look inside. Slowly, I reached out and pulled the door open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. But the feeling of dread only grew stronger. We decided to leave the closet alone and explore the rest of the house. But before we left, we couldn't resist the urge to mess around a little. Being teenagers, we started breaking things: old furniture, picture frames, anything we could find. It was all in good fun, or so we thought. But then we found a doll, an old porcelain doll that had been sitting on a shelf, forgotten for years. We smashed it to pieces, laughing as the shards scattered across the floor. That's when everything changed. Almost immediately after we broke the doll, we heard a noise. It was faint at first, like something swaying in the wind. But there was no wind, and the noise grew louder and louder until it filled the entire room. We looked at each other, our laughter fading as fear took over. We turned towards the window, expecting to see something, anything that could explain the noise. But there was nothing there, just the same dirty, cracked window looking out into the yard. The noise continued, now accompanied by what sounded like whispers, too faint to understand but clear enough to know they were there. We couldn't take it anymore. We bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house, not stopping until we were back at my father's property. We didn't talk about what happened, we didn't need to. We all felt the same thing, that something was wrong with that house, something we couldn't explain. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The noise, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it all haunted me. Despite the fear, I knew I had to go back. I had to see if it was real or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. So a few weeks later, I convinced one of my friends to return to the house with me. This time, we were more prepared. We brought flashlights and a sense of determination to uncover the truth. When we entered the house, it felt different. The air was heavier, and the silence was even more oppressive than before. We made our way back upstairs to the room with the closet. The pile of letters was still there, untouched. We sat down at an old desk that we had found in one of the rooms and started reading through the letters, hoping to find some clue as to what was going on. But the letters were just mundane correspondences, nothing that would explain the strange events. As we were reading, we heard a creaking sound. We looked up to see the closet door slowly opening by itself. My friend and I stared at each other, both thinking the same thing. Was this a prank? Was the other trying to scare us? But the look in my friend's eyes told me he wasn't behind it. We stood up, slowly approaching the closet, our flashlights shaking in our hands. When I finally opened the door fully, I couldn't believe what I saw. Inside was the same doll we had broken weeks earlier, but it was perfectly intact, as if it had never been touched. Confused and terrified, we rushed to the spot where we had shattered it, expecting to find the broken pieces. But there was nothing. Not a shard of porcelain, not a single piece of evidence that we had ever broken it. We didn't know what to do. The fear was overwhelming, and all we could think about was getting out of the house. We ran back downstairs and out the front door, not stopping until we were safely back at my father's house. We didn't return to that house for months, too scared to even go near it. But as time passed, the fear turned into a nagging curiosity. We couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the house, something we hadn't yet discovered. So months later, we decided to go back one last time. This time, we brought another doll with us, hoping to see if the strange events would repeat themselves. But when we arrived, the house seemed different, more decayed, more dangerous. The roof had partially collapsed, leaving parts of the second floor exposed to the elements. The closet door, which had once held such terror for us, was now stuck open, the roof collapse having jammed it in place. Despite the damage, we decided to go upstairs again. We turned on our flashlights and played a quick game of rock, paper, scissors to see who would have to go inside the closet. I lost. As I got down on my hands and knees to crawl in, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but I could make out the words. It sounded like a child, asking if I wanted to play hide and seek. But the voice was distorted, mumbled, and sent chills down my spine. I froze. My friend called out to me, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare into the dark corners of the closet, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, I backed out of the closet and we both ran out of the house, not daring to look back. That was the last time we ever set foot in that house. I'm 20 years old now, and the memory of that day still haunts me. I've seen many things in my life, but nothing has ever scared me as much as that house and the things we experienced there. The haunting experience in the old pink house left a deep impression on me, but it was far from the only encounter I had with the supernatural. As I grew older, I began to hear more and more stories from people in my town, each one more chilling than the last. The stories often involved old, forgotten houses, places where history had left its mark in the most terrifying ways possible. One such story involved a historic brick home that sat on a hill overlooking the Mississippi River. The house was a relic of the past, built in the 1800s, and had seen generations come and go. But what set this house apart from others was the fact that it had been a stop on the Underground Railroad, a place where escaped slaves had once found refuge. The house was full of secret passages and hidden rooms, designed to keep its occupants safe from those who would do them harm. In the early 1990s, the town experienced a great flood, and the house was nearly destroyed. The family who lived there had to move out temporarily while repairs were made, and they allowed a friend of theirs, a librarian named Marge, to stay there in the meantime. Marge was an older woman who had lived in the town all her life. She knew its history well, and she was fascinated by the stories surrounding the old house. When Marge moved in, she quickly realized that the house was not as empty as it seemed. At night, she would hear the sounds of footsteps overhead, even though she was the only one in the house. The footsteps were accompanied by the sound of something being dragged across the floor, a noise that made her blood run cold. Marge was not one to be easily frightened, but the noises were so persistent and so unnerving that she began to lose sleep. One night, Marge heard a loud banging noise coming from the third floor of the house. She had been warned by the previous owners not to go up there, as the floor was unstable and dangerous. But the noise was so loud and so alarming that she felt she had no choice. She grabbed a flashlight and made her way up the creaking stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the top of the stairs, she was met with darkness and silence. There was no one there, no sign of what could have caused the noise. As she stood there, trying to calm herself, she noticed something strange. The door to one of the rooms at the end of the hall was slightly open. This was unusual, as Marge always kept the doors closed to prevent drafts from coming in. She approached the door cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. When she pushed the door open, she was met with a sight that she would never forget. Inside the room, the floor was covered in dust, undisturbed for years. But in the center of the room, there were fresh footprints, small, child-sized footprints that led from the door to the window. The window was closed, but as Marge stood there, staring in disbelief, it slowly began to open on its own. The cold night air rushed in, and with it came the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, faint and distant, as if coming from another time. Marge backed out of the room, terrified by what she had seen. She fled down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until she reached the safety of her car. She never returned to the house after that night, and when the original owners moved back in, she warned them about what she had experienced. But they were skeptical, dismissing her story as the product of an overactive imagination. However, it wasn't long before they too began to notice strange things happening in the house. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close without explanation, and the sounds of footsteps could be heard late at night. The family tried to ignore these occurrences, but as time went on, they became impossible to dismiss. The final straw came one night when the youngest child in the family, a little girl named Emily, woke up screaming in the middle of the night. Her parents rushed to her room to find her standing in the corner, pointing at the window. She was too terrified to speak, but when they looked outside, they saw nothing. The next morning, Emily told them that she had seen a little boy outside her window, staring at her with empty eyes. She described to him in detail the old-fashioned clothes he was wearing, the way his hair was slicked back, and the hollow look on his face. Her parents were horrified, as Emily's description matched that of a boy who had lived in the house over a century ago, a boy who had died tragically while trying to escape to freedom. The family couldn't take it anymore. They moved out of the house shortly after, leaving it abandoned once again. The house still stands on the hill, a silent witness to the horrors that took place within its walls. Those who pass by it at night say they can still hear the faint sound of a child's laughter, carried on the wind, and see the figure of a small boy standing at the window, waiting for someone to come and play with him. Another story that has stuck with me over the years involves a renovation project in St. Louis. A small remodeling company had been hired to update a large ranch home in an upscale neighborhood. The house was typical of the area: 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a living room with a fireplace, and a partially finished basement. The workers had been on the job for a few weeks when they began to notice strange things happening. One day, while working in the dining room, the foreman heard the sound of the screen door in the garage swinging open. This was followed by the sound of footsteps moving through the kitchen and down the hall. Assuming it was the homeowner, the foreman called out, but there was no response. He walked through the house, searching for whoever had entered, but found no one. The screen door was closed and the house was empty. The foreman was puzzled but dismissed it as his imagination playing tricks on him. But later that day, while he was steaming wallpaper off the walls in the kitchen, he heard a series of loud bangs coming from the basement. The noise was so strong that he could feel it through the floorboards. Startled, he stomped his feet on the floor in frustration, only to be met with 3 more bangs in response. This time, the noise was even louder, reverberating through the house. Determined to find the source of the noise, the foreman grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement. The basement was neat and orderly, with nothing out of place. But the sense of unease only grew stronger as he moved through the space. He checked every corner, every nook and cranny, but found nothing that could explain the noise. As he stood there, he heard the banging again, this time coming from directly below him. But there was nothing there, just solid concrete. The foreman quickly left the basement, his nerves on edge. He didn't tell anyone what had happened, not wanting to sound foolish. But over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. Tools would go missing, only to be found in places where they hadn't been left. Lights would flicker on and off, and doors would slam shut on their own. The workers began to feel like they were not alone in the house, as if someone or something was watching them. The final incident occurred when the foreman was working late one night, finishing up some last-minute tasks. As he was packing up his tools, he heard the sound of footsteps coming from the basement stairs. At first, he thought it was one of the other workers, but when he called out, there was no response. The footsteps continued, slowly making their way up the stairs. The foreman felt a cold chill run down his spine as the footsteps grew closer and closer. Suddenly, the basement door swung open, and the footsteps stopped. The foreman stood frozen, staring at the open door, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. The house was silent. Gathering his courage, he walked over to the basement door and peered down the stairs. The basement was empty, just as it had been before, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The foreman quickly locked up the house and left, not daring to return until the next morning. When he arrived the next day, he found the basement door wide open, even though he was sure he had closed it the night before. The tools he had packed up were scattered across the floor, as if someone had gone through them during the night. The foreman knew then that something was very wrong with the house. He finished the job as quickly as possible, but the strange occurrences continued until the work was done. The homeowners moved back in, unaware of the events that had taken place during the renovation. But it wasn't long before they too began to experience strange things. Lights would flicker, doors would open and close on their own, and the sound of footsteps could be heard late at night. The homeowners tried to brush it off, but the incidents became more frequent and more intense. Eventually, they moved out, leaving the house to be sold once again. The house still stands in St. Louis, a beautiful home with a dark secret. Those who have lived there since have all reported similar experiences, each one more terrifying than the last. It seems that whatever haunts the house is not ready to let go, continuing to make its presence known to anyone who dares to enter. The stories of haunted houses have always fascinated me, especially those based on real events. There's something deeply unsettling about a place that holds onto the energy of the past, where the walls seem to remember the tragedies that unfolded within them. These are not just stories, they are echoes of the lives that once filled these homes, echoes that refuse to fade away. One of the most disturbing stories I've ever heard came from a friend of mine who grew up in a small town in Missouri. His house was over 100 years old, built on land that had seen more than its share of sorrow. The house itself was a grand, sprawling structure with high ceilings and wide, wooden staircases that creaked underfoot. But despite its beauty, there was always a sense of something lurking just out of sight, something that didn't belong. My friend's family treated the strange occurrences in their house as if they were completely normal. They had grown used to the unexplained noises, the objects that would move on their own, and the cold spots that would appear out of nowhere. To them, it was just part of living in an old house. But to anyone else, the house was clearly haunted. One of the most common occurrences was the sound of footsteps. The footsteps would echo through the halls late at night, moving up and down the stairs, pacing back and forth, as if someone was searching for something. The footsteps were so clear and distinct that my friend's family would often go to check, expecting to find someone there. But the halls were always empty, the rooms silent, except for the fading echoes of the footsteps. But the most terrifying experience my friend had in that house happened when he was around 12 years old. It was late at night, and he was lying in bed, unable to sleep. The house was quiet, everyone else had gone to bed, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old wood settling. My friend was just starting to drift off when he heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling sound coming from the corner of his room. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind in the dark. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It sounded like something was moving, shuffling through the piles of old clothes that he kept in the corner. My friend sat up in bed, his heart pounding, straining to see through the darkness. He couldn't make out anything at first, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving slowly toward his bed. He froze, unable to move or speak, as the shadow crept closer and closer. It didn't have a distinct shape, just a dark mass that seemed to absorb all the light around it. As it reached the foot of his bed, my friend felt a cold chill wash over him, a cold so intense that it seemed to seep into his bones. He could barely breathe, his chest tight with fear, as the shadow slowly crawled up onto the bed. Just as it reached him, he did the only thing he could think of. He pulled the covers over his head and squeezed his eyes shut, praying that whatever it was would go away. He lay there, trembling, for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. Eventually, the cold began to recede, and the room fell silent once more. When he finally gathered the courage to look, the shadow was gone, leaving no trace of its presence. My friend didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He stayed under the covers, wide awake, until the first light of dawn crept through his window. When he told his parents what had happened, they didn't seem surprised. They simply told him that the house had always had its quirks and that he shouldn't be afraid. But how could he not be? The experience had shaken him to his core, and from that night on, he slept with a light on, never daring to let the darkness consume his room again. Another story that has haunted me for years was told to me by a classmate during my time in school. He lived in a house on the outskirts of town, in an area that was known for its strange and unsettling atmosphere. The house itself was old, dating back to the early 1900s, and had a reputation for being haunted. But what made this story particularly disturbing was the fact that it involved not just one spirit, but several. My classmate's house was located near an old, abandoned town that had been left to decay over the years. The town was rumored to be a place where satanic rituals had been performed, and many people in the area believed it to be cursed. Despite these rumors, my classmate's family had moved into the house, attracted by its large size and affordable price. But it didn't take long for them to realize that something was very wrong. From the moment they moved in, strange things began to happen. Objects would disappear and reappear in different places. Doors would open and close on their own, and they would often hear strange noises in the middle of the night. But the most disturbing thing was the feeling of being watched. No matter where they were in the house, they always felt like someone or something was watching them. One night, my classmate's parents had gone out to a party, leaving him and his younger sister home alone. The two of them were used to the strange occurrences by this point, but that night was different. It was late, around midnight, when they heard a loud banging noise coming from the kitchen. At first, they thought it was just the house settling, but then the noise came again, louder and more insistent. My classmate, being the older brother, decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the kitchen, his sister close behind. As they approached the kitchen door, the banging stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps running through the house. The footsteps were fast and heavy, moving from room to room as if someone or something was searching for them. Terrified, my classmate and his sister ran back to their room and locked the door. They huddled together on the bed, listening as the footsteps grew louder closer. The door to their room began to rattle as if someone was trying to get in. The doorknob turned slowly, but the door didn't open. The footsteps continued to pace outside their room, growing more frantic with each passing moment. Finally, the noise stopped. The house fell silent, and the only sound was the ragged breathing of my classmate and his sister. They waited for what felt like hours, too scared to move or speak. When their parents finally came home, they found the two children still huddled on the bed, wide-eyed with fear. My classmate tried to explain what had happened, but his parents didn't believe him. They dismissed it as the overactive imagination of two scared children. But my classmate knew what he had heard, and he knew that the house was not just haunted by one spirit, but many. The house was alive with the echoes of the past, with the spirits of those who had once lived and died within its walls. And those spirits were not at rest. They were still searching, still trying to find something or someone. The family moved out of the house a few months later, unable to bear the constant fear and unease. The house has since been abandoned, left to decay like the town that surrounds it. But those who pass by it at night say they can still hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, and they can still feel the eyes of the spirits watching them, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to enter their domain. Another story that has always stayed with me was told to me by a woman who had once lived in a care home that was rumored to be haunted. The care home was an old, sprawling building located on the outskirts of Leeds, England. It had once been a grand estate, but over the years it had fallen into disrepair and had been converted into a care home for the elderly. The woman, who we'll call Sarah, had worked at the care home for several years before it was shut down and sold. During her time there, she had heard many stories from the residents about strange occurrences, doors opening and closing on their own, objects moving without explanation, and cold spots that would appear in certain rooms. But Sarah had always dismissed these stories as the imaginings of the elderly. That is, until the night she decided to stay at the care home after it had been shut down. The residents had all been moved to different facilities, and the staff had been laid off. Sarah and a few of her colleagues were tasked with cleaning out the building and preparing it for sale. They decided to spend the night there, as it was too late to go home, and they didn't want to leave the building unattended. The care home was eerily quiet that night, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an unsettling silence. As they went about their tasks, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The feeling grew stronger as the night went on, and by the time they were ready to go to bed, she was thoroughly spooked. Sarah decided to sleep in one of the empty rooms close to her colleagues. She didn't want to be alone in the dark, not after everything she had heard. As she lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, she heard a soft, rhythmic breathing sound coming from the corner of the room. At first, she thought it was one of her colleagues, but when she looked around, she realized she was alone. The breathing grew louder, more insistent, as if something was standing right next to her bed. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to rationalize the noise, but there was no logical explanation. She could feel the breath on her face, cold and damp, and the sound of the breathing was so close that it was as if someone was standing right over her. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blood-curdling scream. It was so loud and so terrifying that Sarah bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, but there was no one there, no sign of what could have made the noise. Terrified, she ran out of the room and woke her colleagues, telling them what had happened. They tried to calm her down, but the fear was too strong. Sarah couldn't go back to sleep, not with the memory of that scream echoing in her mind. The next morning, as they finished their work and prepared to leave, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had been watched the entire time. She was convinced that the care home was haunted, that the spirits of those who had died there were still lingering, still trying to make their presence known. When the care home was finally sold, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the new owners knew about its dark history. She hoped that they would never have to experience the terror that she had felt that night. But deep down, she knew that the spirits would not rest, that they would continue to haunt the building, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to enter their domain. Haunted places often carry the weight of the past, as if the walls themselves have absorbed the emotions and experiences of those who once lived there. The energy left behind can be unsettling, sometimes terrifying, and it can linger for years, even centuries, waiting for someone to notice. These places don't just tell stories, they are the stories etched into the fabric of the building, replaying over and over like a record stuck on repeat. One such place is an old farmhouse that has stood in the countryside for over 100 years. The house has been in the same family for generations, and with it, the stories of its haunting. My friend's family lived in this farmhouse, and to them, the strange occurrences were as normal as the changing seasons. The house was full of memories, some happy, some tragic, but all of them left their mark. The farmhouse had always been a place of life and activity, filled with the sounds of children playing and the smell of home-cooked meals. But beneath the surface, there was something darker, something that whispered in the dead of night when the house was quiet and the shadows grew long. My friend grew up hearing the stories from his parents and grandparents, stories of doors that would open and close on their own, of cold spots that would appear without warning, and of objects that would move as if guided by an unseen hand. But the most chilling experience he ever had happened when he was a teenager. It was a cold winter's night, and a storm was raging outside. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow fell thick and fast, covering the ground in a blanket of white. My friend was alone in the house, his parents having gone to town for supplies. He was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when he heard a noise coming from the kitchen. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the noise persisted, a rhythmic tapping sound, like someone drumming their fingers on the table. Curious, he got up and walked into the kitchen. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glow of the stove. The tapping noise continued, coming from the far corner of the room. My friend slowly made his way across the kitchen, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached the corner, the tapping stopped, replaced by a cold gust of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. My friend shivered, suddenly feeling as if he wasn't alone. He turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind him, but there was no one there. The kitchen was empty, silent, except for the faint sound of the wind outside. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a shadow, darker than the rest of the room, standing in the corner where the tapping had come from. The shadow was tall, its edges blurred, as if it was made of smoke. My friend froze, unable to move, as the shadow slowly began to take shape. It grew taller, more defined, until it resembled the figure of a man. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but my friend could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He wanted to run, to get out of the house, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the shadowy figure. It was as if he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure began to fade, dissolving back into the darkness. The cold wind subsided, and the kitchen returned to its normal state. My friend was left standing there, shaking with fear, unsure of what had just happened. He ran out of the kitchen and up to his room, locking the door behind him. He didn't come out until his parents returned later that night. When he told them what had happened, they didn't seem surprised. They told him that the house had always been that way, that there were things in the house that couldn't be explained, but they assured him that whatever it wasn't harmful, just a part of the house's history. My friend wasn't so sure. The experience had left him shaken, and from that night on, he avoided the kitchen whenever he was alone in the house. Another story that comes to mind involves a young woman who moved into an old Victorian house with her husband. The house was beautiful, with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and large windows that let in plenty of light. It was the perfect home for the couple, who had been looking for a place to start their family. But from the moment they moved in, the woman felt uneasy. There was something about the house that didn't feel right, something she couldn't put her finger on. At first, it was just little things: a cold spot in the hallway, a door that wouldn't stay shut, the feeling of being watched. But as time went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more frightening. The woman would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom door. She would get up to check, but there was never anyone there. The footsteps would continue, pacing back and forth, sometimes stopping just outside her door. One night, she woke up to find her bedroom door wide open, even though she was sure she had closed it before going to bed. She got up to close it, but as she reached for the doorknob, the door slammed shut on its own, nearly catching her fingers. The woman was terrified, but her husband dismissed her fears, telling her that it was just the house settling, that old houses made noises, and that there was nothing to be afraid of. But the woman couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She began to notice other things, objects that would move on their own, shadows that seemed to flicker at the edge of her vision, and the constant feeling of being watched. One day, while cleaning the house, she found an old photograph tucked away in a drawer. It was a picture of a family standing in front of the house, taken many years ago. But what caught her attention was the figure of a woman standing in one of the windows. The woman's face was blurred, her features indistinct, but there was something about her that sent a chill down the young woman's spine. She showed the photograph to her husband, but he dismissed it, saying it was just an old photo and that there was nothing strange about it. But the young woman couldn't get the image out of her mind. She began to have nightmares, vivid and disturbing, in which the woman from the photograph would appear, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with cold, empty eyes. The dreams became more frequent and more terrifying until the young woman could barely sleep. She became paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder, afraid that the woman from the photograph would appear. She even began to hear a voice, soft and whispering, calling her name in the dead of night. The voice would wake her up, and she would lie there, trembling, too scared to move. One night, the young woman woke up to find the figure of the woman from the photograph standing at the foot of her bed, just as she had seen in her dreams. The figure was more distinct now, more real, and the young woman could see the anger and hatred in her eyes. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the young woman could feel the intense hatred radiating from her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or look away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure faded away, leaving the young woman gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. The next day, she packed her things and left, leaving her husband behind. She never returned to the house, and she never spoke of what happened there again. The house was sold, and the new owners never reported any strange occurrences. But the young woman knew that whatever had haunted her was still there, waiting for the next person to come along. One of the most chilling stories I've ever heard involved a small cottage in the English countryside. The cottage was old, with a thatched roof and stone walls that had stood for centuries. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find in a storybook, quaint and picturesque, surrounded by rolling hills and fields of wildflowers. But beneath its charming exterior, the cottage held a dark secret, one that had been hidden for years. The story goes that a young couple had moved into the cottage, excited to start their new life together. They had been drawn to the cottage by its beauty and its history, and they couldn't wait to make it their own. But from the moment they moved in, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just little things: a door that wouldn't stay shut, a light that would flicker on and off, the sound of footsteps in the attic. The couple dismissed these things as quirks of an old house, nothing to worry about. But as time went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more frightening. The couple would hear voices in the middle of the night, soft and indistinct, as if someone was whispering just out of earshot. They would wake up to find objects moved from where they had left them, and they would often feel a cold breeze pass through the room, even when all the windows were closed. One night, the woman woke up to find her husband standing at the window, staring out into the darkness. She called his name, but he didn't respond. She got out of bed and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. He was cold to the touch, and when he finally turned to look at her, his eyes were blank, empty, as if he was in a trance. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, staring at her with those empty eyes. Terrified, the woman shook him, trying to snap him out of it. After a few moments, he seemed to come back to himself, blinking and looking around in confusion. He had no memory of getting out of bed, no memory of standing at the window. He just remembered going to sleep and then waking up with his wife shaking him. The woman was deeply disturbed by the incident, but she tried to brush it off as a bad dream. But the next night, the same thing happened. She woke up to find her husband standing at the window again, staring out into the darkness with that same blank expression. This time, she didn't try to wake him. Instead, she watched him, waiting to see what he would do. After a few moments, he turned and walked out of the bedroom, moving slowly and deliberately, as if in a daze. The woman followed him, her heart pounding with fear. He walked through the house, down the stairs, and out the front door, into the cold night. The woman watched in horror as he walked down the path to the garden, stopping in front of an old, twisted tree that stood at the edge of the property. He stood there for a long time, just staring at the tree, before finally turning and walking back into the house. The woman quickly ran back to bed, pretending to be asleep when her husband returned to the bedroom. The next morning, he had no memory of what had happened, and when the woman told him about it, he laughed it off, saying she must have been dreaming. But the woman knew what she had seen, and she knew that something was very wrong with the cottage. She began to investigate the history of the house, trying to find out if anything had happened there that could explain the strange occurrences. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. Years ago, before the cottage had been built, the land had been the site of a gruesome murder. A woman had been killed there, her body buried beneath the twisted tree in the garden. The tree had grown up around her grave, its roots entwining with her remains. The locals believed that the woman's spirit still haunted the land, trapped by the tree, unable to move on. The woman was terrified by what she had learned, but she didn't know what to do. She didn't want to leave the cottage, but she was afraid that if they stayed, her husband would fall deeper under the spell of the spirit that haunted the land. She tried to convince him to leave, but he refused, dismissing her fears as nonsense. Then, one night, the woman woke up to find her husband standing at the window again, staring out into the darkness. This time she didn't hesitate. She grabbed him by the arm and shook him, trying to wake him up. But he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring out at the twisted tree, his eyes blank and empty. In a panic, the woman ran out of the house into the night. She didn't stop running until she reached the village, where she found help. When she returned to the cottage with the villagers, they found her husband lying on the ground in front of the twisted tree, unconscious. He was alive, but he had no memory of what had happened, no memory of how he had ended up outside. The couple left the cottage that very day, never to return. The cottage was sold, and the new owners were warned about the land's dark history. But they, too, experienced strange occurrences, and eventually they moved out as well. The cottage has since fallen into disrepair, abandoned and forgotten, but the twisted tree still stands, its roots entwined with the remains of the past, holding onto the spirit that haunts the land. There's a unique kind of terror that comes with feeling a presence that you cannot see, a sense that something or someone is watching you, even when you are alone. This kind of fear digs deep into your psyche, turning the familiar into the unknown, making every creak, every whisper, a source of dread. The stories I've shared so far have all touched on this fear, but there are others that delve even deeper into the unsettling world of the unseen. One such story comes from a woman who inherited her grandfather's house, a place she had visited many times as a child. The house, located in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was typical of the 1950s modest, with 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a cozy living room. But despite its outwardly ordinary appearance, the house held secrets that were anything but. The woman, who we'll call Laura, moved into the house shortly after her grandfather passed away. She had fond memories of the house from her childhood, and she was excited to make it her own. But from the moment she moved in, she began to feel that something was not right. It was little things at first: a strange feeling of being watched, an odd noise in the middle of the night, the sensation of a cold draft passing through a room, even when all the windows were closed. As the days went on, these occurrences became more frequent. Laura would often wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps on the stairs, footsteps that would stop just outside her bedroom door. She would lie there, frozen in fear, listening as the footsteps would slowly retreat, disappearing into the silence. No matter how many times it happened, it never failed to terrify her. But the most unsettling experience happened one night when Laura was sitting in the living room, reading a book. The house was quiet, and she was finally starting to feel at ease. But as she turned the page, she heard a soft whisper coming from behind her. It was so faint that at first she thought she had imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, her name being called in a voice that was not her own. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, this time from the other side of the room. It was as if the voice was moving around her, circling her, taunting her. Laura's heart raced as she tried to find the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The house was empty, just as it had been all evening. Terrified, Laura ran upstairs to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She sat on the bed, her heart pounding, listening for any sound, any sign that she was not alone. But the house was silent, the only sound the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Laura stayed awake all night, too scared to close her eyes, afraid that the whisper would come again. The next morning, she called a friend and told them what had happened. Her friend tried to reassure her, telling her that it was probably just her imagination, that she was still grieving her grandfather's death, and that it was natural to feel unsettled in a new home. But Laura knew that what she had heard was real, that there was something in the house that didn't belong. Over the next few weeks, the whispering became more frequent. It would happen at odd times when Laura was cooking in the kitchen, when she was getting ready for bed, even when she was in the shower. The voice would call her name, soft and insistent, always just out of reach, always just on the edge of her hearing. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the voice would not go away. Desperate for answers, Laura began to research the history of the house. She discovered that her grandfather had bought the house shortly after World War II, and that the previous owners had been a young couple who had lost their only child in a tragic accident. The child, a little girl, had died in the house, and it was said that her spirit had never left. Laura realized with a sinking feeling that the voice she had been hearing was that of the little girl, still calling out, still searching for someone to hear her. Determined to find a way to put the spirit to rest, Laura contacted a local paranormal investigator. The investigator came to the house, bringing with him all the tools of his trade: EMF meters, infrared cameras, and digital recorders. He spent the night in the house, hoping to make contact with the spirit. Laura stayed with him, too scared to be alone. Throughout the night, the investigator recorded several instances of unexplained activity. The EMF meter spiked repeatedly, and the infrared camera captured strange, shadowy figures moving through the house. But it was the digital recorder that provided the most chilling evidence. When the investigator played back the recording, Laura heard the whisper again, clear and unmistakable, "Help me." The voice was that of a child full of sorrow and fear. Laura's heart broke as she listened, realizing that the little girl's spirit was trapped, unable to move on. The investigator suggested performing a cleansing ritual, hoping that it would help the spirit find peace. Laura agreed, and the next day, they carried out the ritual, filling the house with the scent of sage and the sound of prayers. After the ritual, the whispering stopped. The house felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Laura never heard the voice again, and she began to feel more comfortable in her home. But she never forgot the sound of that little girl's voice, the sadness in her plea for help. It was a reminder that the past is never truly gone, that it can linger in the places we live, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Another story that comes to mind involves a young couple who bought a house in a small town in New England. The house was old, built in the late 1800s, and had a charming, rustic feel to it. The couple, excited to start their new life together, moved in with high hopes. But they soon discovered that the house had a dark side, one that they were not prepared for. From the moment they moved in, the couple began to experience strange things. The house was full of unexplained noises, footsteps, doors creaking open and shut, and the sound of something being dragged across the floor. At first, they dismissed these noises as the house settling, but as time went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more disturbing. One night, the wife was home alone while her husband was away on a business trip. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard a loud crash coming from the living room. She ran into the room, expecting to find that something had fallen, but the room was empty. Nothing was out of place, and there was no sign of what could have caused the noise. As she stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened, she heard another noise, a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. The sound was coming from the hallway, and as she listened, it grew louder, moving closer and closer to the living room. Terrified, she grabbed a knife from the kitchen and stood in the doorway, waiting to see what would happen. The scraping noise stopped just outside the living room door. The wife held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, the door began to creak open, inch by inch, as if someone or something was pushing it. But when the door was fully open, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, silent, except for the echo of the scraping noise that still lingered in the air. Shaken, the wife called her husband, begging him to come home. When he returned, they searched the house from top to bottom, but they found nothing that could explain the noise. The house was quiet again, but the wife couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The couple began to experience more strange occurrences over the following weeks. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker on and off, and the sound of footsteps could be heard late at night. The wife became increasingly anxious, afraid to be alone in the house, but her husband tried to reassure her, telling her that it was just her imagination. But then something happened that neither of them could explain. One night, they were both awakened by the sound of a loud bang coming from the basement. They ran downstairs, fearing that someone had broken in, but the basement was empty. However, the door to the old coal room at the back of the basement was wide open, even though they were sure they had closed it. The husband decided to investigate, even though the wife begged him not to. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the coal room, with the wife following close behind. As they entered the room, they were hit with a blast of cold air, so cold that it felt like they had stepped into a freezer. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As the light steadied, they saw something that made their blood run cold. In the corner of the room, there was a large, dark stain on the floor. The stain was old, but it had a strange, oily sheen to it, as if it had been there for a long time. The husband knelt down to get a closer look, and as he did, the light flickered again, and they both heard it the sound of something breathing, deep and raspy, coming from the darkness. The couple bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind them. They didn't stop until they were back upstairs, with every light in the house turned on. They didn't sleep that night, too terrified to close their eyes. The next morning, they called a priest to bless the house, hoping that it would drive away whatever was haunting them. The blessing seemed to work, and for a while the house was quiet. But the couple never felt truly comfortable there again. The sense of unease lingered, like a shadow that followed them wherever they went. They eventually decided to move, selling the house to a new family, but they never spoke of what had happened there. They just wanted to forget, to leave the past behind and move on. But the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you run. The new owners of the house soon began to experience the same strange occurrences: the footsteps, the noises, the feeling of being watched. They, too, eventually moved out, leaving the house abandoned and empty. It stands there now, a reminder of the unseen presence that still lingers within its walls, waiting for the next family to make it their home. As we've seen from these stories, the supernatural is not something to be taken lightly. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there is no denying the power of these stories, the way they can chill you to the bone and make you question what you know about the world. The houses we've explored tonight are more than just buildings. They are repositories of memories, of emotions, of experiences that have left an indelible mark on those who lived there. Perhaps that's why these stories resonate with us so deeply. They remind us that the past is never truly gone, that it can linger in the places we least expect, waiting to make itself known. And they remind us that sometimes the scariest things are not the ones we can see, but the ones we can feel, the ones that lurk just out of sight, waiting for the moment when we are most vulnerable. So, the next time you find yourself alone in an old house, and you hear a creak in the floorboards or a whisper in the dark, remember these stories. Remember that you might not be as alone as you think. And remember that the unseen presence that you feel might be more real than you ever imagined.